She'd been gone for years. Then, one random afternoon, a live TV broadcast caught a face in the crowd. A face that shouldn't have been there. What happened next would change everything. Clearwater, Oregon was the sort of place where the world seemed to hold its breath. Nestled between a jagged stretch of coastline and miles of evergreen forest, it existed in a rhythm older than the people who lived there. Mornings began with the cry of gulls over the harbor and ended with the whisper of the tide creeping back in under the moonlight. Nights were long, quiet, and mostly uneventful. It was the kind of town where even gossip felt sluggish, taking its time to reach you. For Martin Hale, the quiet had long ago stopped being a comfort. At 50 years old, he lived alone in a small single-story house on the western edge of town, where the wind off the Pacific could turn the windows into rattling drums. His life had shrunk over the years to the simplest of routines. Mornings spent fixing small appliances for neighbors, afternoons repairing fishing gear at the docks, evenings eating dinner in front of the television. He spoke to fewer people now. He preferred it that way, or at least that was what he told himself. In truth, he had become accustomed to the stillness because it demanded nothing of him, and nothing was easier to give than nothing at all. That Tuesday evening in late October had been like any other. The rain had fallen most of the day, leaving the streets slick and the air smelling faintly of salt and wet cedar. Martin sat in his worn armchair, a blanket draped over his knees, the television remote balanced loosely in his hand. A single lamp glowed weakly in the corner of the room, casting more shadow than light, leaving the edges of the room in a comfortable dimness. The television was tuned to Channel 7's late news broadcast, which Martin watched out of habit rather than interest. It filled the silence. The anchor's voice was calm and practiced, moving from a segment on local fishing quotas to the seasonal reminder about setting clocks back for Jews. Daylight savings. Martin barely listened, eyes drifting toward the rain sliding down the window beside him. Then, without warning, the screen changed to bright, moving colors. The county fair coverage. The footage was cheerful, almost jarring after the monotone news desk. The camera panned across the fairgrounds, past strings of lights hanging between booths, the slow, steady spin of the Ferris wheel, the crowd pressing shoulder to shoulder along the midway. People laughed. Kids clutched prizes nearly as big as themselves. Vendors leaned over counters, passing paper trays of steaming food into eager hands. It was then, in that wandering sweep of the camera, that Martin saw her. She was walking alone near a cotton candy stall, wearing a faded green jacket zipped to her collarbone. Her hair was braided loosely over one shoulder. At first, she was just another face in the crowd, until the angle shifted and she turned her head toward the camera. The fairground lights caught her eyes, green and sharp, even through the slight grain of the footage. Martin sat forward, the blanket sliding to the floor. Those eyes. It wasn't possible. And yet there she was. Emily. His little sister. The sister he had not seen in 34 years. In an instant, the living room felt smaller, the air heavier. His pulse thudded in his ears. He leaned toward the screen, searching for some hint that he was wrong, that the likeness was coincidence. But the details were undeniable. Her gaze, steady and knowing. The faint upward curve at the corner of her mouth that always seemed on the verge of becoming a smile. The memories crashed over him uninvited. September 1988. A Tuesday afternoon. Emily had been 8 years old, small for her age but fast and fiercely independent. She had been wearing her yellow raincoat, her school bag slung over one shoulder, a library book tucked under her arm. She was supposed to walk the 6 blocks from school to their house. Somewhere along that walk she disappeared. No one had seen her after she passed the corner store. The search had consumed their lives. For weeks the police combed the town and the surrounding woods. Neighbors volunteered, combing through ditches and fields. Flyers with her photograph, bright-eyed, smiling, were taped to telephone poles and shop windows. Every possible lead dissolved into nothing. Eventually, the police declared it likely she had been abducted. His parents clung to hope for a year, maybe 2, before grief wore them down. Martin had been 16 then, old enough to understand the finality in the way the search. Parties stopped meeting, in the way people stopped bringing up her name. And now, here she was on the television, walking through the county fair, as if no time had passed. Older, yes, lines at the corners of her eyes, her hair darker. But it was her. The reporter's voice was still talking about fair attendance numbers, but Martin didn't hear a word of it. He leaned closer to the screen, almost afraid to blink. He had trained himself over decades to accept that Emily was gone. But now, staring at the screen, he knew the truth. She was alive. Which meant the past 34 years held answers he had never dared to imagine. And somewhere deep down, a question he had not asked in decades rose in him again, sharp and cold. Where had she been all this time? And who, if anyone, had let her go? Martin's hand shot to the remote, nearly dropping it as he fumbled to rewind. The clip jerked back too far, showing the anchor again at the news desk. He pressed play, then slowly inched forward until the fairground lights spilled across the screen once more. The camera moved past the Ferris wheel, along the line of game booths. Martin's eyes scanned the crowd as if he were physically there, searching for that familiar green jacket. And then, there. Emily. He paused the footage so abruptly the frame flickered. She was mid-step, one hand at her side, the other briefly lifting as if adjusting her braid. The angle was slightly different now, more of her face visible. His breath caught. Time had carved faint lines into her features, softened the fullness of her cheeks, but it had done nothing to change the gaze. Those eyes, green and alert, looked out from the screen with the same intent focus he remembered from childhood. They had always been the color of new leaves, the kind that catch light in a way that makes you look twice. But it wasn't just recognition that unsettled him. It was the expression behind them. She wasn't smiling, not even in the casual way strangers sometimes do when caught on camera. Her eyes weren't curious or distracted. They were watchful. He hit play again. In the next moment, her gaze flicked to the left, quick and deliberate. That was when Martin saw him. At first, the man was just another body in the moving crowd, a blur of dark leather, a flash of white at the wrist. But as Martin slowed the footage, the man's shape resolved. Brown leather jacket, crisp white shirt cuff visible beneath the sleeve. The man's head was tilted slightly forward, his gaze fixed, not on the booths, not on the path ahead, but directly on Emily. Martin paused, staring at the still image. Something about the man's posture was wrong. It wasn't casual interest. His focus was too direct, too measured, the way someone might study a photograph or watch a mark they mean to follow. Memories, unbidden and sharp, pressed against the edges of Martin's thoughts, the sound of sneakers slapping wet pavement. Emily glancing over her shoulder with a grin as she darted ahead of him in the rain, her yellow raincoat flaring behind her. That look had been playful, teasing. But here, in the grainy fair footage, the look was different, calculating, maybe even fearful. He stepped closer to the screen, almost touching it, as if proximity could make the image give up more detail. The pixels began to break apart under the zoom, but the essence of the scene remained. Emily was walking fast, her body angled slightly as if to slip between people, and the man in leather was matching her pace, just a step or two behind. Martin's gut clenched. This wasn't coincidence. He replayed the scene again and again. Each time, he noticed something new. How Emily's head moved minutely, scanning without turning fully. How the man's eyes never wavered. How, in the half-second before the camera panned away, her hand twitched near her jacket pocket, like she might be reaching for something. He hit pause once more and took out his phone. snapping photos of the still frame from every possible angle. The images weren't perfect. Slight reflections from the screen dulled the contrast, but they were enough to keep, enough to study. The rest of the news segment blurred into meaninglessness. Martin sat there long after the broadcast ended, the television screen going black and reflecting his own drawn face. The quiet of the house settled in, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator down the hall. He thought about the police, about walking into the station with this evidence, demanding they reopen the case. But what exactly did he have? A few seconds of footage, a woman who might be his sister, a man who might be following her. After 34 years, would anyone believe him? Or would they nod politely, file the report under unsubstantiated, and go back to their routines? A deeper question formed in the back of his mind, one he didn't want to entertain, but couldn't shake. If Emily was alive, and if she was here in Clearwater, why hadn't she come to him? The thought twisted in his chest. Either she didn't want to be found, or someone didn't want her to be. Outside, the rain had started again, a steady tapping against the window. Martin didn't move. He sat in the dim room, staring at the paused image on his phone, the green jacket, the watchful eyes, and the shadow of a man who might be the key to a mystery that had haunted him for more than half his life. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. Tomorrow, he decided, he would start finding answers. Sleep was out of the question. Martin lay on his back in bed for all of 15 minutes before the restless energy got the better of him. His mind replayed the fairground clip over and over, each pass revealing some new subtlety he'd missed. The way Emily's shoulders were slightly hunched, the brief narrowing of her eyes when she glanced toward the man in the leather jacket, the way her pace never slowed. By 1:20 a.m., he was back in the living room with the television on, remote in hand, running the DVR feed at half speed, then a quarter. His laptop glowed on the coffee table, browser tabs open to half-finished searches. Clearwater County Fair security footage. Channel 7 news archives. Missing person reappearances after decades. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying the scene again. There, a narrow lane between two vendor tents, barely wide enough for two people to pass shoulder to shoulder. Emily turned into it without hesitation. The man followed. The camera's focus shifted to a group of children laughing near a ride, and by the time it swung back to that lane, it was empty. Martin froze the frame, staring into the empty stretch of gravel path on the screen. How far could they have gone in the seconds the camera was away? Where did that lane lead? The footage didn't tell him. The urge to act was building in him like a rising tide. He knew he couldn't simply sit here and hope for answers to drop in his lap. This was his sister, his Emily, and she was within reach for the first time in 34 years. He needed more. On impulse, he searched for the contact information for Channel 7's newsroom. Their main number went to voicemail after hours, but an email directory came up. The name Dennis Rourke, evening news producer, caught his eye. Martin typed out a message, keeping it terse but urgent. I need to view the raw footage from your fair coverage. This is a matter of personal importance. Please respond as soon as possible. He hovered over the send button for only a moment before clicking. Then came the waiting, the kind that stretches time until it feels like the clock has stopped. He refreshed his inbox every few minutes, the glow of the screen painting his tired face in pale light. At 3:04 a.m., a reply arrived. We can arrange for you to view the footage. Faces in the crowd are private, so it must be done on site at our studio. The words seemed harmless on the surface, but one sentence gnawed at him. Faces in the crowd are private. That wasn't a generic disclaimer. It was a deliberate, pointed reminder. Someone at Channel 7 had noticed something in those faces. By late morning, Martin stood in the narrow reception area of the Channel 7 building, the faint scent of burnt coffee drifting from somewhere down the hall. Dennis Rourke, a tall man with a thinning hairline and a clipped way of speaking, led him to an editing suite. Dennis didn't ask many questions, though Martin could feel the weight of unspoken ones in his glances. He queued up the uncut fair footage on a large monitor. The raw video had no commentary, just the hum and clamour of the fair. The camera roamed through the grounds for nearly 20 minutes before reaching the segment Martin had memorized. There she was again, Emily, in green, moving with purpose. And there he was, the man in the leather jacket, matching her every turn. Martin leaned in, his eyes darting from detail to detail. Twice, Emily passed close enough to the camera for him to see the faint glint of something in her jacket pocket. A phone? A keychain? He couldn't tell. Each time she slipped out of sight, the man followed within seconds, never closing the distance, but never letting it widen. Then came the lane between the vendor tents. In the raw footage, the camera lingered just a second longer before turning away. Martin caught something he hadn't seen before, a faint shift in Emily's posture, like she was bracing herself for what came next. The lens panned toward a different part of the fair, and when it returned, both were gone. The space between the tents was empty, save for a paper cup rolling in the breeze. Martin felt the old, familiar ache in his chest, a mix of frustration and fear. He had lived with that ache since the day Emily vanished, but now it was joined by something else, something sharper: determination. He thanked Dennis, pocketing a slip of paper with the fairground's off-season access contact. As he stepped back into the pale daylight, he knew where he was going next. If Emily had walked into that lane, then so would he. The county fairgrounds looked different in daylight, stripped of the glitter and chaos that had filled them in the footage. The Ferris wheel stood motionless against the pale autumn sky, its painted cars swaying gently in the breeze. Booths that had been alive with colour and sound were shuttered now, their fronts locked behind weathered plywood panels. The air smelled faintly of old fryer oil and damp sawdust, scents that clung even after weeks of disuse. Martin parked near the main gate, a simple chain-link affair with a sign that read, "No public access." The number Dennis had given him connected him with a groundskeeper named Bill McCutcheon, who now stood waiting with a ring of keys at his hip. Bill was a heavy-set man in a worn cap, his voice low and unhurried, like someone who'd been speaking to empty spaces for too long. "You're the guy from the TV station?" Bill asked. "Something like that," Martin replied, careful not to give too much away. Bill unlocked the gate and let him in. "Not much to see now. Most of the rides get taken down for winter storage. Everything else just sits." Martin let the words wash over him, his attention fixed on matching the physical space to the version in his mind, the version from the broadcast. He could hear the echo of the crowd in his memory, the laughter and music that weren't there now. They walked past the Ferris wheel, down the main stretch of the Midway. Martin counted booths in his head. 1, 2, 3. There. The cotton candy stall from the footage, its striped awning rolled tight, its counter littered with the ghostly outlines of where jars and tins had once sat. From here, Emily had turned left. The lane between the two vendor tents was still there, narrower than Martin expected. The canvas walls on either side bowed inward slightly, as if they'd been hastily packed up after the fair. The gravel underfoot crunched softly as he stepped inside. It felt different here. Quieter, more enclosed. The wind stilled, and the sounds of the empty fairground seemed to fall away. Martin walked the length of the lane, counting his steps. Halfway through, he paused, picturing Emily in this exact spot. Her jacket, her braid, the man in leather a few paces behind. At the end of the lane, the space opened into a small service area. A line of portable restrooms stood along one side, their plastic walls faded from sun and salt air. Beyond them was a gate, taller than he'd expected, its metal frame rusted at the hinges. It opened onto a gravel road that disappeared toward the highway. Martin stepped closer. The gate wasn't locked, just hooked shut with a loop of chain. He bent to examine the ground. The gravel was loose, with darker patches where recent rain had pooled. That's when his eye caught something, a faint glint, just beneath the surface. He crouched, brushing aside a layer of grit. It was a charm, no larger than a thumbnail, tarnished silver in the shape of a tiny book. A delicate hinge ran down one side. His hands shook slightly as he pried it open. Inside was a minuscule photograph, blurred by water damage, but still recognizable. Emily. Her face was younger here, no more than the age she'd been in 1988, hair loose, expression bright. Martin's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a trinket. It was hers. He knew it in the way you know something beyond doubt. A sound behind him snapped his head up. A slow scrape, like a shoe shifting on gravel. Martin rose quickly, scanning the service area. Nothing moved. The lane behind him was empty. The wind picked up again. Ratty, ling the chain against the gate in a metallic rhythm. But then he saw it. On the inside of the gatepost, just above knee height, someone had carved 3 letters into the wood. The marks were fresh enough to still show pale against the weathered grain. E.L. Emily Hale Lancaster. His heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't a random find. This was a sign. A message. And it hadn't been here long. Martin stood in front of the gate for a long time, the wind pressing cold against his neck, his thumb tracing the carved letters again and again. The initials were small, careful, deliberate. Emily had always written like that, even as a child. Her block letters neatly aligned as if she expected them to be examined later. It was proof. Proof she'd been here. Proof she wanted someone to know. He took a photo of the carving with his phone, then slipped the tiny charm into his pocket. The metal was cool against his skin, a strange comfort. Bill, the groundskeeper, had wandered off to check something near the main entrance, leaving Martin alone in the service area, which was why the voice startled him so badly. "You're looking in the wrong place." He spun around. A man stood at the far end of the lane, where the tents opened back into the midway. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a weather-beaten coat zipped to the collar. A baseball cap shadowed his eyes, but even from this distance, Martin could see the deep lines around his mouth. "Do I know you?" Martin called. The man didn't answer the question. "She's not here anymore." His voice carried in the still air, low but firm. "And if you're smart, you'll stop digging." Martin took a step forward, his pulse thudding in his ears. "Who are you talking about?" The man tilted his head slightly. "You know exactly who." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then the man turned and disappeared behind one of the shuttered booths, his footsteps muffled by the gravel. Martin hurried after him, rounding the corner in seconds, only to find the midway empty. The man was gone. Bill reappeared a few minutes later, jingling his keys. "Find what you were looking for?" Martin swallowed the urge to tell him about the stranger. If this man was involved with Emily, or with the man in leather from the footage, then saying the wrong thing to the wrong piece. Urson could shut every door before he even got it open. Instead, he nodded and said, "Yeah, I think so." On the drive home, he replayed the encounter in his head. The voice, the way the man knew exactly what Martin was looking for, and the warning, "Stop digging." It only strengthened his resolve. Back at his house, Martin spread his findings across the kitchen table. The photo charm, the picture of the carved initials, still frames from the fair footage. He stared at the image of the man in leather, zooming in on his face as much as the pixelated image would allow. A sharp jawline, slight stubble, eyes partially hidden by the brim of a cap. He wore no visible ID, no badge, nothing that suggested he was part of fair staff or security. The leather jacket was well fitted, broken in but not worn out. Expensive. Martin pulled out his old laptop and logged into a public records search site, punching in what little he could describe. Male, mid-40s to mid-50s, average build, associated with Clearwater County. It was like throwing a stone into the ocean. The results came back in the thousands. So he tried a different approach. He went back to Channel 7's email and found Dennis's reply, reading between the lines. Faces in the crowd are private. That phrase, it had weight. Martin typed a new message. The man following her, do you know who he is? Minutes later the reply came, terse. We can't disclose names, but he's been seen before. Not just here. Martin stared at the screen. Not just here. That meant other sightings, other places. The thought chilled him. This man had a history, and Emily had crossed his path before. Before he could reply, his phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. No words, just a single image. It was the same shot from the fair footage, Emily in the green jacket, but this time the image was cropped tightly around her face. Someone had drawn a red circle around her eyes. And beneath it, in block letters, she doesn't want you to find her. Martin sat frozen, the phone heavy in his hand. Someone knew he was looking, and now they knew exactly how to reach him. Martin didn't sleep that night, not that he expected to. The red-circled photo lingered in his mind, as vivid as if someone had painted it on the inside of his eyelids. He kept glancing at his phone on the table, half expecting another message to arrive, half dreading what it might say. By 5:30 a.m., he was in his car, driving aimlessly through Clearwater's still dark streets. It was habit more than strategy. Moving kept his thoughts from calcifying into panic, but it also gave him a chance to watch, to see if anyone was watching him. They were. He first noticed it as he crossed an intersection near the edge of town. A black SUV, headlights dimmed, rolled through behind him and took the same turn. He told himself it could be coincidence, but as he made 3 more turns in different directions, the SUV stayed in his rear view. At a deserted gas station, Martin pulled in and parked. The SUV passed without slowing, disappearing into the grey light of early morning. He waited another 15 minutes before getting back on the road, but the tension in his chest didn't loosen. Someone had marked him. When he got home, he powered up his laptop again, his coffee cooling untouched at his side. The search shifted now, not just for Emily, but for the man in leather and whoever might be working with him. He dug through old news archives, court reports, and local police bulletins. It was hours before something surfaced, a grainy surveillance still from a 2015 robbery in a neighboring county. The man in the image was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, but the jawline and the leather jacket were the same. The article named him as Victor Rudd, a person of interest who had never been apprehended. No current address, no known employment. Martin printed the photo and pinned it to the growing collection on his kitchen wall. Beneath it, he wrote in block letters, Victor Rudd. Why Emily? He was still staring at it when his phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. This time there was no image, just a location. Dockside Storage, Unit 14, 8 p.m. No explanation, no sender. Every instinct told him it was a trap. But another instinct, just as strong, told him it might be his only real chance to get answers. The day crawled by. Martin avoided phone calls, kept the blinds half closed, and checked the street every hour. Once, around mid-afternoon, he thought he saw the black SUV again parked a block away, but by the time he stepped outside, it was gone. At 7:30 p.m., he was parked across from Dockside Storage, watching the entrance from a distance. The place was a flat expanse of corrugated steel doors under dim floodlights, bordered by chain-link fence. The cold air smelled faintly of the nearby river. He waited until the last moment, then slipped inside, moving quickly past the rows of units until he found number 14. The door was half open, a single strip of yellow light spilling out onto the pavement. Emily? His voice was low, tentative. Silence. He pushed the door the rest of the way open. The unit was small, maybe 10 by 10 feet. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, casting sharp shadows over the contents. A folding chair, an overturned crate, and on the far wall, a corkboard covered in photographs. Every one of them was of Emily. Some were old, from before she vanished. Others were recent, including the fairground stills Martin had seen. One in particular made his stomach turn. Emily standing outside what looked like a run-down motel, her green jacket zipped to her chin, her gaze fixed on someone, or something, out of frame. Pinned below the photos was a sheet of paper. On it, in handwriting he knew as well as his own, were 4 words. "Don't follow me, Martin." The air in the unit seemed to close in around him. Behind him, somewhere in the maze of storage, Rose. A door clanged shut. Martin froze, every nerve screaming at him to move, yet his feet rooted to the concrete floor. The sound of the metal door slamming somewhere behind him reverberated through the still air, its echo lingering far too long. He turned toward the unit's entrance, scanning the narrow strip of light beyond. Nothing moved, but the silence felt unnatural, too heavy, as if the place itself were holding its breath. Martin shut the door just enough to narrow the gap, but kept it open an inch, listening. His eyes drifted back to the corkboard. The photographs weren't just random sightings. They'd been organized. Dates were scribbled beneath each one in pencil, some as recent as last month. And then he saw it. One photo circled in red ink. Emily in the green jacket, standing at a street corner, in a place Martin didn't recognize. The date, August 14th, 2:47 p.m., the same day as the fair. Which meant she'd been seen elsewhere that day. His gut told him this wasn't Victor Rudd's work alone. There was a pattern here, but he was still missing a piece. The scrape of a shoe on gravel outside the unit jerked his head up. Martin stepped back into the shadows just as a figure appeared in the doorway. Victor Rudd. Up close he looked older than in the footage. Lines deeper around the eyes, stubble peppered with grey. But the jacket was the same. He scanned the room once, his gaze settling on Martin almost instantly. "You're persistent," Victor said, his voice low, almost conversational. "Where is she?" Martin demanded. Victor tilted his head, as though weighing how much to say. "She's alive. That's all you need to know." "That's not enough," Martin shot back, taking a step forward. "You've been following her for years. Why? What do you want from her?" Victor's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "It's not what I want. It's what she doesn't want from you." The words hit harder than Martin expected. "So, he's my sister." "She's not your sister anymore," Victor said evenly. "Not the girl you remember. She made a choice, and you coming here, digging, it's going to undo everything she's built." Martin's pulse pounded in his ears. "You're holding her against her will." "If I were," Victor said, "do you think she'd keep leaving you messages? That charm you found, the initials on the gate? Those weren't breadcrumbs to follow, they were warnings." Martin searched his face for any sign of deceit. "Then why the surveillance? Why the photos?" "Because there are people who want to hurt her," Victor said, stepping closer. "And every time you come sniffing around, you make it easier for them to find her." Martin wanted to believe he was lying, but something in his tone, something in the weary set of his shoulders, felt too measured to be fabrication. "I don't believe you," Martin said finally. Victor sighed, as if the conversation was already over. "Then here's your choice. Walk away now, and she stays safe. Keep going, and you'll see her again. But you won't like the way it ends." Before Martin could respond, Victor stepped back into the corridor, his footsteps fading quickly into the cold night air. Martin followed a few steps, but by the time he reached the corner, Victor was gone. The storage yard was empty, the silence rushing back in. He returned to the unit, staring once more at the circled photograph. Emily's eyes seemed to meet his, even through the faded print. Calm, but with something behind them. Not fear, not quite sadness. Resolve. He pocketed the photo, switched off the bulb, and stepped out into the dark, locking the unit behind him. He didn't know yet whether Victor was protecting Emily or keeping her prisoner. But he did know one thing. Walking away was no longer an option. Whatever she was hiding from, he was going to find it. And when he did, he'd know if Victor was telling the truth, or if this was all part of something far worse. The night air felt heavier than it should have. Martin kept glancing over his shoulder as he left the storage yard, half expecting the black SUV to roll past or Victor to appear again from the shadows. Neither happened. But the silence had a weight to it, one that followed him all the way to his car and settled in the passenger seat like an unseen passenger. He drove without turning the radio on, the only sound the hum of tires on asphalt. His mind kept looping back to Victor's words. She's not your sister anymore. What did that mean? That she'd changed so much she wouldn't recognize herself? That she'd become someone dangerous? Or that she was hiding from something neither of them could control? By the time he reached home, exhaustion had sunk into his bones, but sleep was impossible. He sat at the kitchen table with the circled photograph in front of him. The background in the shot, a cracked sidewalk, a leaning streetlight, was unfamiliar, but there were hints. A faded billboard in the distance, the corner of a diner sign. If he could place it, he could find her. Martin scanned the image into his computer and began digitally enlarging every corner. Hours passed. The coffee pot went from full to empty. At last, he froze the image on the diner sign, half obscured by glare. The name was almost illegible, but the last 4 letters, BURG, were just clear enough to read. It was a thin lead, but it was all he had. He started cross-referencing small towns within 100 miles, looking for diners with similar names. Just after dawn, he found one. Milberg Cafe, in a town 2 counties over. He left before the sun had fully risen, driving back roads to avoid the main highway. The town of Milberg was little more than a main street lined with faded storefronts. The cafe sat on the corner, its paint peeling but the open sign glowing faintly in the window. Inside, the air was teat, hick with the smell of bacon and coffee. A few locals sat at booths, their conversations low. Martin took a seat at the counter, ordering nothing, just watching the door. At 8:12 a.m., she walked in. Emily. Older, yes, the lines at the corners of her eyes deeper, her hair shorter, but there was no mistaking her. She wore a grey coat now, no green jacket, but her walk was the same, steady, purposeful. She carried a paper bag and moved straight to a booth in the corner, sliding in with her back to the wall. Martin's breath caught. He wanted to call her name, but something in her posture stopped him. She didn't look around, didn't scan the room. Instead, she reached into her coat pocket, pulled out a folded piece of paper, and laid it on the table. It faced him. From across the cafe he could make out the writing. Leave now. Trust me. Her eyes lifted for the briefest second, meeting his across the room. There was no warmth there, no recognition in the way he'd hoped, only an urgent plea. Then she looked past him, toward the door. Victor Rudd stepped inside. Martin didn't move, but every muscle in his body coiled tight. Victor walked to Emily's booth, sat down across from her, and said something too low for Martin to hear. Emily didn't argue. She just nodded once. A moment later, they both stood and walked out together. Martin remained frozen, watching through the cafe's front window as they crossed the street to a dark sedan. Victor opened the passenger door for her. She got in without a backward glance. The car pulled away, swallowed by the narrow streets of Milberg. Martin sat there long after they'd gone, the folded paper still lying on the table where she'd left it, as if daring him to pick it up. He did. On the back, in her handwriting, was one more line. If you love me, stop. For now. Martin folded the note carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know when or how, but this wasn't over. Because Emily Hale Lancaster was alive, and no matter what she thought she was protecting him from, Martin knew the truth. He wasn't walking away. There were still too many questions, too many pieces missing, and the next time he found her, he wouldn't let her disappear again. Keep watching the Witness Archives. Some stories end with answers, others end with the promise of a reckoning. This one is far from over.